If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke, the 12th chapter. This is where we'll be today. In Jesus' day, a rabbi, and Jesus was considered to be a rabbi by most of the Jewish people that encountered him as he had his earthly ministry in Palestine. A rabbi wore many hats. They were obviously, for the Jews, the pastors of their day. That was one of the hats. They were lawyers. Some of them were very acquainted with the Jewish law, and they would be called in to settle cases where Jewish law was pertinent to the case. They would also be called in to arbitrate. If you had a dispute, let's say that James and I were disputing over the ownership of a piece of land, a rabbi would be one of the first people we might call in to come settle that dispute for us. So the rabbis wore a lot of hats. They were counselors, they were spiritual leaders. And in this instance, this person in the crowd who calls Jesus out and asks him to settle the dispute, this would not be unusual at all in a Jewish setting. So I'll begin reading in verse 13 of chapter 12. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus said, Who appointed me to arbitrate over you? Then he said, "Watch out and be on guard against all kinds of greed. Your life doesn't consist in the abundance of your possessions." Then he told him a parable. He said, "A certain rich guy had a farm that produced a good crop. And the man thought to himself, 'What will I do? I have no place to store my crops. I know what I'll do. I'll build bigger barns and tear the ones that I have down. And then I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you've got plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required from you. Who then will get what you've prepared for yourself? And this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for themselves but isn't rich toward God.'" Now Jesus is using this common situation where a person in a crowd would look at Jesus and say, he's the guy that can settle this dispute. He's a rabbi, so I'll ask him. But Jesus isn't going to have it. And I was in a crowd one time. I'll never forget it because it's one of those things where you're in the crowd and you're just listening along and you're thinking mind might be drifting a bit, and all of a sudden you hear your name called from the front. And hot sweat pops out, and you realize that you have become the sermon illustration that day. Now that happened to me once. I never forgot that feeling. That's why I don't do that in here, because I know what it feels like. But Jesus called this guy out and turned him into a sermon illustration. "Who appointed me to arbitrate between you and your brother?" And then he uses it to make a point. I'm sure the guy was embarrassed. I know I was when it happened to me. But the warning he gives is one toward greed, which was remarkable because it doesn't seem to fit necessarily where Jesus has been going with all of this at this point. But what we're looking at here is actually a portion of the Sermon on the Mount. Luke records it differently than Matthew does. Matthew records it in one big block. Luke kind of scatters it throughout his gospel. And the warning comes, and I'll just say it again. I said it in Sunday school. I don't like this text. I just don't like it. It's a hard text. It's one of those texts that if I'm reading my Bible, I read really fast when I get to this spot. Try to move on to something more easily taken in, because this is not one of those. Now, I'm just going to settle one question right away. Is Jesus in this text telling us to divest ourselves of everything we possess and be a pauper? No, he is not. How do I know that? Jesus had his headquarters at Peter's house. Did you know that? In Capernaum. Peter's parents' house was a house. They owned it. And so they were taking in the 12 and Jesus in to make that the headquarters. So they owned a house. So this is not the text that's telling you and me, take every last thing you have of value and get rid of it and do something with it for the kingdom. It's not saying that. But it does take us into some really, really tall grass. And that's the tall grass of justice. Now, quantifying the word greed, I don't even know how to do it. It's one of those words that we think about and we think we know what it means until we try to describe it. And then we don't know anymore. Because one person's greed is another person's want. I mean, if you were to bring in somebody right now from, say, the inner barrios of Brasilia, in Brazil, and plant them here, if they came in through the doors and walked past all these vehicles, and then they came in and found just this many people in here, they would think we were the richest people they'd ever known in their life. Because for them, if there are 2 cars out there and 60 people in here, that would seem about right. But there are lots of cars and just a few people. So for them, you ask them what greed is, it's going to be a very different answer than if you ask Bill Gates what greed is, or you ask the governor of Georgia what greed is, or you ask a lawyer, or anybody. So this word becomes very, very, very difficult to define. And I'm not even going to try it, because I don't know how to do it. In some cultures, greed is obviously not a tremendous problem because there's not enough there to be greedy about. In this culture, greed is a hidden thing. It's hidden. It's not something that we see directly. John Wesley in England in the 18th century, he was confronted with this issue because John Wesley did open air preaching. Do you know he preached 40,000 sermons? That's a lot. That's a lot of sermons. You're doing a lot of preaching. Preached till he was 87, and at 87 he said, I'm becoming more and more lazy. It's becoming far more difficult to get up before 5:30 at 87 years old. There's an example. But he said something about this issue. He said, I save all I can save, and then I give away all I can give away. And that's how he quantified it for himself. That seems like a reasonable thing. In Wesley's day, we have a tax code here. It's 19 notebooks stuck together. I don't see how. That's why every year, if you have your taxes filled out by someone else, I sure do, I pay somebody because I don't want to be sitting in front of a man and having him go through every receipt I own and saying, how did you spend this money? I want to say, bring the accountant in with me. And they say, you talk to him. I don't know anything. I just write the checks. Well, in Wesley's day, taxes were just as complicated in England as they are for us. And there was what was known as the plate tax. The plate tax. And I thought, what is a plate tax? So I did some reading on it. I said, I don't even understand what that means. Turns out, in England, they weren't getting enough revenue, and so they thought, I know what we'll do. We'll tax everybody's silver. Not the silver you buy, but what you own. And every year, we'll take a tax for the silver that you actually possess. So they started scrutinizing Wesley's tax returns. And they thought, this guy doesn't give us, we're not getting, Wesley's a famous person. Surely, he's got a lot. So they went to his house. All the officials come in, and what do they find? Wesley says, I got 4 spoons. I own 4 spoons. They said, Wesley, you only own 4 spoons? That's right. Why do you only own 4 spoons? He said, how can I buy silver when so many around me want for food? Now this question that Jesus is asking here, it comes as an enormous conviction for me. I've got stuff, and I like my stuff. I've got a computer sitting up here. I got a mouse for it too. And I've got a little camera over here that records the sermons. And I've got a backpack back here. And there's a cell phone laying on the bench. And there's a car parked out there. And I've got a home that I'm going to take all this stuff back to add it to the stuff that's all already there. I've been speaking now, according to my little clock here, for 6 minutes. See, I'm watching this stuff. You think, don't even bother looking at the clock, because I'm going to make sure we're out of here before 12. It's going to be all right. I promise. But I'm looking at this little clock, and I've been speaking for 6 minutes. Every day, and let me just give you a global comparison. In this country, we abort 1.5 million children a year. That's a lot. In the world, 6 times that many starve to death every year. 25,000 children a day starve to death. Now, that means since I started talking, about 100. So let's take this church and fill it up with 100 children, kill them, and bring in every 5 minutes 100 more. And do that all day long and do it every day. That's the world we live in right now. That is the world. Now, we don't feel that here. We don't. And I'm pleased. This is hard. These are hard things. I don't like any of this. I don't even like this text. But this is the text. Now, I know that nobody in this room, nobody is stingy. I know that. I know that when you hear a statistic like that, your heart is broken. My heart's broken. There's no way to listen to a statistic like that and not have a broken heart. No way. But there are questions that come to me, and so I'm just going to share them today because these are the questions that Jesus is asking all of us about these issues. I know that we're raising a son still, even though he's 21 now.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And Becky and I were having a conversation about him. You know, he's still learning to manage money. He doesn't know how to manage money. And Becky said, I wonder if we could get him to just stop and ask himself the question every time he goes for his wallet, do I really need this thing? That would help him a lot. It would help us a lot, too. And we don't really ask that question very often of ourselves. We don't. I don't. So please don't hear me saying you. We don't. We don't ask ourselves. In this country, this whole economy is built upon you've got to have the newer thing. I mean, this computer now is 4 years old. For a computer, that's a paperweight for most people. I love this thing, by the way, but even so, there's going to come a day where it's going to quit working. And so I'm going to be forced then to ask myself that question, is this something that I just want, or do I really need it? I mean, in most households, a computer in 2/3 of the world is just an utter luxury. For us, it's just another one of the normal things we all have, which we add to all the other things we have. Notice in this parable, when Jesus talks about this rich man, just go through and count the number of times he says, I, me, and mine. What does it tell us? It tells me that two things. One, he's only concerned with himself, and he's concerned with this world. He's not worried about the next one at all. And the second thing it tells me is he should be, because he's going to leave this one and go to that one, as are we. He only thought about his future ease and security. There's a Roman proverb that says this. I love this proverb. It was a proverb that was common. It's Roman, not Christian, Roman. It was a proverb that was common among the middle class in Rome during the time of Jesus. And it goes this way. Money is like seawater. The more you drink of it, the thirstier you become. And I think that's right. Now, what's the lesson for us regarding this passage? I remember when I first joined the second band I traveled with in 1985. How many of you in this room know who Tony Campolo is? Okay. 3. That's okay. There's a whole segment of Christianity, different segments where people are very famous. He's written probably 24 books. And when I first joined the second band, we traveled with him. And so I've heard him speak about 100 times, at least that many times. He came to our church. Well, the first time I ever heard him, I joined the band, and it was a church where the cars in the parking lot, I would say 70% of them had windshield wipers on the headlamps. I mean, these were cars that at 1985 were $100,000, which I don't know what that would be today. I'm not that kind of financial genius, but I can tell you they'd be a lot more. Okay, he came into the church, and just like this, he's speaking, and he gave that did you know that 25,000 children a day is a static statistic? It's unchanged since 1985. It's not changed. That many starve to death every day somewhere in the world just for lack of food. He gave that statistic, and then he said this, and I'm not going to do that, but Tony, man, he did this all the time. He said, you know, when I came in here today, I noticed a lot of really nice cars out there. He said a lot of them look like they're worth several tens of thousands of dollars. He said, did you know that he said, I've got a Buick. He said, it's 5 years old. I bought it used. He said, it cost me $5,000. He said, my Buick will go the speed limit just as well as that Bugatti out there goes the speed limit. He said, it's got air conditioner. It's got cloth seats. He said, it takes me I can get in today and drive to California and back if I want to. I can go anywhere I want to go. He said, so if you've got a Bugatti out there, he says, I'll never forget this. When he started doing this, there's 500 people in this congregation. You could have heard a fly burp on the back wall. I mean, it was dead quiet. He said, you could take that Bugatti out there and sell it. And you could go buy a $10,000 Buick, which back then was about what it cost to buy a new one. He said, and you could take that other $70 or $80 or $100,000 and you could support a dozen missionary nationals, and he named a bunch of countries like Bolivia or wherever, for the rest of their lives, and they would never have to worry about whether or not they could be supported. And you could still go everywhere you want to go, and you'd have a nice car. He says, it was so quiet, I could feel the tension, because I'm looking around at guys that are wearing suits that cost more than my car costs out there now. I mean, literally, there were guys in $50,000 suits. And there was a wealth there that I can't even imagine. And here's this little portly guy telling them they're wrong to be like that. And I just thought, wow. Are we preparing all of our preparation in this world? Is it for this life? Or are we thinking about the life to come? There was a guy in Las Vegas. He was a tiger trainer. I don't like those acts. Do you like those acts? I don't enjoy those acts at all. But this is back in the 60s. They had this big cage. It was like 40 feet long and 15 feet wide. It had 8 tigers in it. They rolled it out and would hit those little stomp things that drop the wheels down so the cage wouldn't move around. And then the tiger trainer would open the door and go in, and all he had was a whistle and a whip. That's all he had. 8 tigers. Now, of course, if the tigers had decided that they hadn't been fed sufficiently that day, the whole show would be over in just a few seconds. But it went on. So here, 5-10 minutes into the show, and all of a sudden, in this Las Vegas auditorium, the electricity failed and all the lights go out. Now, I don't know if you know anything about cats, but they can see really, really well in the dark. Those lights going out didn't affect them one bit. They could see that trainer. The trainer couldn't see any of them, nor could the crowd. You know, if they do those tiger acts, there's some of them, you know, where they walk the tigers out on a leash and they're loose. When that happens and I'm in the auditorium, I'm out. I'm not staying in the auditorium with a tiger just held by a leash. These were in a cage. But the whole crowd just gasped when the lights went out. But they could hear the whistle and they could hear the whip and they heard the trainer shouting commands. And the lights came back on, and there are the 8 tigers. They've been jumping through hoops and standing on chairs and standing on each other's back. And the guy opens the cage and comes out, and everything's fine. Everybody claps and goes home. Nothing bad happened. What happened? They asked him later. They said, weren't you afraid? He said, oh, you better believe it. He said, I know how well they can see in the dark. He said, but they don't know how well I can't see in the dark. You see, he was ready. He knew that all he had to do was be ready for that eventuality and everything would be all right? Are we looking at this life and saying this is the only one? Are we not making ourselves ready for the eventuality that this is not the only one? Does it affect what we decide about how our lives are going to go? This man in this parable assumed no next life. He wasn't worried about it a bit. He was only concerned about his security here and now. Now, again, be careful. Remember, Peter's parents had a house, and Jesus and his group stayed there. What's being asked? What's being asked? I don't know. I don't know. And you can go through the Old Testament, you can read Amos, and you can see how God is going to judge Israel because they are taking advantage of people. Is this country and we as participants, are we taking advantage of people? The statistics seem to say that we are. I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how to fix any of that. Pray for the Congress. That's a good thing to do. Write them letters. That's a good thing to do. Pray for those nations that are suffering. Those are good things to do. But that doesn't change Rip's metric as to what God is saying Rip should do at all. Remember the widow's mite? Remember that story? Jesus told that, how this widow comes into the temple and all of these Pharisees and Sadducees were very wealthy. They come in and they put their big old offerings, all kind of gold, and it's tinkling up there as it falls into the treasury. Everybody wants to hear how much these guys are giving. And then this poor widow comes up and she drops what would equivalent to a couple of dimes. And Jesus looks over and says, she gave more than all of these. Now, we look at that story and we admire it. I admire it. That just seems like here's a faithful person doing the very best they can to support the kingdom of God. That story's not there to make me feel good. It's not there to make us feel good. It's not there so we'll admire the widow. It's there to teach us something. Now, what it teaches you, what it teaches me, I don't know. I'm not going to say. I don't feel qualified. I'm not Tony Campolo, so I'm not going to worry about what anybody in this room does with their income. That is not my problem. I have a problem. What does Rip do with his? When I know that 25,000 children every day are dying just because they don't have enough to eat. What am I doing about that? Am I making choices? Am I asking myself, when I go to buy something, do I want it or do I need it? And if I don't need it, am I then willing to say, you know what? I'm going to say to myself, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to take that amount and I'm going to give it somehow to somebody who really, really does so that those children don't starve. Now, those kinds of questions, I hate those kinds of questions. I don't even like doing this today. I'm being totally honest with you. I'm not saying this so that anybody will just think, wow, Rip's a great guy. He's not a great guy. These kinds of texts trouble me as much as they trouble anybody in this room, maybe more. I don't know. Because I feel like I've got a lot. But what God is asking of us, and this is the only thing I'm going to ask of us, not me, not you, us. Are we willing? Are we willing to just open ourselves up to God and say, Lord, what would you have me do? How would you have me take what I have and invest it toward the next world, not this one? And I'm not talking about this church. I'm not talking about missionaries. I'm not talking about the Georgia Baptists. I'm talking about where somebody doesn't have enough food to eat that day. What would you have me do? That's all I'm asking of us today. Are we willing to ask God about that and to be open to whatever He'd show us? That's all. It really comes down to that, and it comes down to a question that I ask myself about this that we're doing here. What does it mean to have success as a church? I don't know the answer to that either. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me about this church,